It's probably wishful thinking, but I am not Brother Paul, even though I may look like him and look as old as he does. But you're stuck with me this afternoon instead of Brother Paul. You would probably be better off if he was up here before you. But hopefully the time that we'll spend together today will hopefully challenge us, make us think about how we serve Jesus and how we interact with others. The last couple of weeks, I've been introducing the lessons with this set of 4 numbers. And I want to do so again today. These numbers are kind of a crude analysis, a crude way of presenting the data about how Jesus answered questions. The questions that we have recorded for us in the Gospels. At least in the Gospels, we have 113 different questions that were asked of Jesus. Of those questions, 52 were asked by his disciples and 61 by others, whether it was the Pharisees, the Sadducees, or someone else. But out of all those questions that were asked of Jesus, he only answered 3 directly. There were only 3 that he responded to in a direct type manner. Of those 3, it's John chapter 18. Pilate asked Jesus, says, "So you say you are a king?" And Jesus says, "It is certainly as you say." Or the text that Mark led us in Luke chapter 11, which is some of your translations kind of phrased as a request. The disciple said, John's disciples are taught how to pray. Teach us how to pray. How should we pray? And Jesus responds with the model prayer. And then the passage that Luke read for us in Matthew chapter 22. A lawyer came and asked Jesus this question to test him. What is the foremost commandment? Or what is the heaviest commandment of the law? And it is to love your God with everything that you have. And only those 3 did Jesus really answer directly, at least those that we have recorded for us. But if he didn't answer directly, how did he answer? Well, in the last couple of lessons, we looked at some of the ways that he answered. He sometimes didn't answer at all, or he answered with silence. He chose not to respond. Other times, he answered with a question. Fact is, Jesus loved to ask questions and answer with questions. The Gospels record some 307 different questions that he asked throughout his 3-year ministry. And sometimes he answered with an illustration. Now, the reason that's important, or why I bring those up to you, or keep bringing those up to the degree we can, I think we ought to want to answer questions like Jesus did. Because he is, A, the master teacher, but B, he's supposed to be our model in all things, right? He's the one we pattern our life after. He's the one we talk like and we think like. He's the one we act like. And if this is how he answered questions, the questions people ask him, shouldn't we think about those as well? Last week, we looked at the first 2, the idea of answering with silence or answering with another question. Today, I really just want to look at the idea of answering with an illustration. I think maybe the prime example of that with Jesus is found in Luke chapter 10. Luke chapter 10, we know this as the parable of the Good Samaritan, but I want you to see it really as an answer to the question that was posed to him. Luke chapter 10, look at beginning in verse 29. But wanting to justify himself, he said to Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied or answered and said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he encountered robbers. And they stripped him and beat him and went away, leaving him half dead. And by coincidence, a priest was going down on that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise, a Levite also, when he came to the place, saw him and passed by on the other side as well. But a Samaritan who was on the journey came upon him, and when he saw him, he felt compassion, and he came to him and bandaged up his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them. And he put them on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. On the next day, he took 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper and said, 'Take care of him, and whatever more you spend when I return, I will repay you.' Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the robber's hands?" And he said, "The one who showed compassion." Then Jesus said to him, "Go and do the same." So do you see how this begins? It begins the lawyer asking Jesus a question, hoping to justify himself. Who's my neighbor? How does Jesus answer? He tells a story.
He uses a parable. He uses an illustration. And then after that, he ends with a question, doesn't he? He says, so which of these three proved to be the neighbor? And the lawyer, despite his attempt to justify himself, answered the question. He was led to the answer by the illustration that Jesus used. It forced him to look inward and to be honest with himself and at least say, in the context here, it was the one who showed compassion. I will tell you a lot of times that Jesus answered with an illustration. I mean, one of the ways that he answered are with parables. I mean, the fact of the matter is if there's one form of teaching or an answer that is most associated with Jesus, it's a parable, right? But what is a parable? A parable is really just kind of an extended illustration, a more elaborate illustration, a story that Jesus used to really answer questions that were either spoken or unspoken in the hearts that were around him. I will tell you that I want you to think about this, and I was thinking about this the last week as I was putting together this lesson, how indelibly linked parables are with Jesus. The fact of the matter is there were periods in his ministry that he chose to only address people in parables or only address them in that way. Turn over to Matthew chapter 13. Matthew chapter 13, beginning in verse 34. And he says, all these things Jesus spoke to the crowds in parables, and he did not speak anything to them without a parable. This was so that it was spoken through the prophet would be fulfilled. I will open my mouth in parables, and I will proclaim things hidden since the foundation of the world. And so maybe the question is, what did he hope to accomplish with parables? Why did he use them this way? Well, this text tells us at least one reason. He quotes from Psalm 78 in verse 2, and he said it was to reveal things that had been hidden from the very foundation of the world. Things that were once a mystery, but now in the presence of the audience that we're speaking to, he would show them these things, reveal them, uncover them. But at the same time, when we think about earlier in Matthew chapter 13, when he explained to his disciples why he spoke in parables, he said it was also to conceal them. Look back in Matthew chapter 13, verse 10. And the disciples came up to him and said, why do you speak to them in parables? And Jesus answered, to you it has been granted to know the mystery of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. Verse 13, jump down. Therefore I speak to them in parables because while seeing they do not see, and while hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. So why did Jesus speak to them in parables? Well, it was both to reveal and to conceal. And you say, well, how's that possible? How can one story do both those things? Well, go back to part A. Jesus is the master teacher, partly, but because the parables were like the kingdom they so often illustrated. It would draw those who were humble, but it would repulse those who were proud. The parables had a winnowing effect. It would separate really the heart of the people who were asking the questions. But I don't want you to just think that Jesus only spoke in parables. That was not the only way he used illustrations in his answers. All of his teaching, it was just full of illustrations where he would pull from common everyday things so it would apply to the situation and help illuminate the answers that he would give. You think about when he called Peter, Andrew, James, and John, those individuals who had spent their lifetime on the Sea of Galilee as fishermen. How did he call them, and what did he tell them their new occupation would be? They would be fishers of men. Do you think that resonated with them? They had spent their whole lives fishing, and they'd somehow grasped that I'm going to be casting nets out into the world and drawing in a catch for my Lord. You think about in Matthew chapter 18, when they would argue about who would be the greatest in the kingdom, and Jesus took a child who was in their midst, and he said, you must become like little children, like a simile, an illustration, to show them what their demeanor and their attitude had to be, the level of their humility. Or you might think of John chapter 15, where he talks about branches and vines and fruit, a land that were filled with vineyards and where it was such a part of their culture, and they could all grasp it. He said, but this is what it means for you to live a life connected to me and produce fruit. He used illustrations all over the place. And I will tell you, that's his genius. I hope you understand what I mean when I say Jesus is genius, because typically that's a word we associate with human intelligence, someone who's above intelligent. Jesus was God. His thoughts were so far above genius. But it was really Jesus' genius that he could take things and see the parallel between this thing and that thing and express that, and doing so make people think a little bit more, to ponder the question a little more. And I will tell you, illustrations are important. They need to be part of our speech and how we answer people, because they are truly effective tools that the Master has given us. I mean, they inform and they instruct us. I mean, everybody will tell you that a picture causes people to remember a picture more than they will something you say. Just a general truth, a proposition. We have that statement, a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? Or somebody might say it this way, a picture turns ears into eyes. What that does is people remember the illustration often more than just the general statement of truth that you might answer that with, because it involves a different part of our brain. They tell us it involves the visual spatial intelligence. And people will remember the illustration far longer than just if you give them a simple answer. Illustrations, they explain, they clarify. Illustrations have this power about them that are able to take Bible truths, complex ideas, and they have an explanatory power. It's kind of like you share this illustration with somebody and they go, aha, or they see it, or the light bulb turns on. They can form connections between Bible ideas and real life, but they also form connections between the one who's asking the question and the one who's answering it. Illustrations help people see the relevance of the Bible to their lives. Let me clarify this one. The Bible is relevant. Illustrations don't prove that, but they reveal it. They show it. They show how this passage relates to your life. They can personalize and particularize. They explain biblical doctrines. I mean, take a passage like Matthew chapter 6, verse 33, right? Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Everybody in here can quote that, right? But what does that look like? What does that mean? How does that apply to you? What is the relevance for your life? Well, an illustration might help fill the gap. It means giving up things. It means making decisions based upon only upon putting God first. It means I'm not going to make decisions based upon my children, my spouse, what pleasures me, what's easy. Seeking first says that I am always going to put God first, and I'm going to make decisions what's best for him and my relationship to him in the world. And so somehow you can take that one passage that is an absolute biblical truth and try to make it relevant to our lives. So we need to answer like Jesus. And so how do we go about doing that? Well, I will tell you, we need to just learn to start making simple comparisons between things. We don't need some elaborate story, some complex tale of woe or success. We need to just make simple comparisons. So much of what Jesus taught was just in simple everyday language that all of his audience, whether they were a high priestly caste or fishermen or prostitutes or tax collectors could see and understand the message that he was trying to give them. I mean, somebody comes to you and wants to ask questions about the resurrection and say, how in the world could God take these particles that have been dispersed through the ground over a millennium, bring them back and resurrect them? How in the world can God do that? Well, you say, for God, it's no more than waking someone up who's asleep. Because that's what John chapter 11 says, doesn't it? Or you just take and make simple analogies between things so people can start to grasp those things. You start drawing things from everyday life. That's what Jesus did, right? He'd take the water in a bucket at a well. He would take a coin that might have the head of Caesar on it. He would go by and point to a garden path or a garden plot. He would look at wheat or tares that were in a field or vines. Just common everyday things that would make it accessible to the message accessible to the people he were talking to. And I'm going to make this point. How many of you at home have a commentary set of some kind or other? Have you ever opened one of those commentaries and you almost need a dictionary to read it? There was a brother by the name of Moses Lard who he worked with a college over at now the University of Kentucky, the Kentucky Bible School, and he wrote a commentary on Romans, and they said, people always made the joke, it was the only commentary you needed a commentary to interpret. Is that what you got to do with Jesus? Jesus used simple, everyday things to talk about complex and otherworldly ideas. His language was accessible. And we draw from creation. That's what Jesus did. I mean, he talked about doves and serpents, dogs and swine. The Bible is full of illustrations. They're swift as a gazelle or an eagle, or as fierce as a roaring lion. We can use those illustrations to make the Bible truths come alive. Now, how many of you are saying at this point, I can't do that? Yeah, I can't do that. I'm not very creative. I'm not very inventive. I'm not. I mean, look at my PowerPoints. I mean, if you get any plainer with my brain doesn't work that way. I can't think up on the fly some wonderful illustration or some analogy that just doesn't work. Let me tell you the good news. You don't have to. You have in your hands a collection of illustrations that will answer most of the questions that people have. And they're not illustrations that you have to make up. Most of these illustrations are poignant and real-life experiences that people can see what the gospel will look like in their lives. To borrow a phrase from our last gospel speaker, you have in your hands a heavenly library that are full of illustrations that you can use to answer people's questions. I mean, what if somebody comes to you and says, well, I'm suffering. How do I deal with suffering? How does God know? Does God care? How can I endure? Well, I mean, we may not be able to answer every question, but you know what I can do? I can tell them about a servant by the name of Job who suffered. I mean, look at James chapter 5 and verse 11 and just begin there and start giving them an illustration of what it looks like in their lives. You see, we count those blessed who endured. You have heard of the endurance of Job and have seen the outcome of the Lord's dealings, that the Lord is full of compassion and he's merciful. You have seen the outcome of the Lord's dealings. Or maybe you have got questions about enduring hardship. I mean, look, we live in a wicked society. My household's wicked. The workplace where I go is wicked. How do I be a Christian? Can I keep it up? Can I endure? You can point them to one of the righteous servants of God by the name of Lot, whose soul was tormented day after day. I mean, look at 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 8. 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 8. If I can get there. He says, "For by what he saw and heard, that righteous man, while living among them, felt his righteous soul tormented day after day by their lawless deeds." Verse 7, that speaks of Lot. On just an aside, how many lessons do you hear about the righteous servant Lot? I mean, most of the time we talk about how he made bad choices, and it did, and it cost him his family. But Lot was still able to live righteously in Sodom and Gomorrah. And his soul day after day was tormented by the things that he saw and he heard because he knew there was something different. I will tell you, that is a poignant example. It's an illustration of what it means to live in wickedness and godliness, that you're going to have to be in this strait between these two things. And it's not always going to be pleasant. Or what if people ask questions, is it worth it? You know, I've got to make these changes in my marriage relationship, or I've got to change who I date or what I do with my life. Is it worth it? What kind of answer could I give them to that? I mean, maybe you're like me and you go, well, I didn't have to give up a whole lot to choose to follow Jesus. Maybe you don't feel qualified to answer that question yourself based upon your own experiences. The Bible's full of people who had to give up all kinds of things to make a decision to follow Jesus Christ. Maybe you could turn to Philippians chapter 3 and look at the Apostle Paul, who gave up every advantage that the world would recognize as superlative, as moving forward, as getting him ahead of others. And he said, I counted all of that as rubbish. You had this man who was intelligent, who was predisposed not to believe the gospel story, who had every reason to ignore what Christ had called him to do. He was advancing above his countrymen. He was being groomed for the Sanhedrin, and yet he said, knowing Christ is worth it all. That's an illustration that would answer a question for anybody. We just need to start thinking like that. We need to learn to answer like Jesus. I'll leave you with two passages that I ended the lesson with last week. Two simple proverbs to challenge each and every one of us. Proverbs chapter 16, verse 23, the heart of the wise instructs his mouth and adds persuasiveness to his lips. You think about that. What does that say to you? It says, before I answer the question, I think about what might be the most persuasive way to answer it. What might persuade you? What might challenge you? What might incite you to do more? And finally, Proverbs chapter 15, verse 28. The heart of the righteous ponders how to answer, but the mouth of the wicked pours out evil things. And so I just simply want to challenge you with these three lessons. Let's try to answer like Jesus. Let's try to encourage to be more like him in every aspect of our lives, especially as we answer the questions that are asked of us. I don't know if you think about this very often, but the world has a lot of questions, and they're good questions, and they deserve answers. But we just don't want to tell them. We want to lead them to Jesus Christ so we can have a more meaningful conversation about what it means to be a follower of God and why it's worth it. So let's learn to answer like Jesus. That's the lesson for the hour. Thank you for your kind attention in listening to that. Our brother Boyd has selected a song we're going to sing at this time. It's going to be a song of encouragement that talks about how much God loves you and wants you to respond to his call. How he wants you to save you and wash you clean through the blood of Jesus Christ. If you have a need today to deal with sin in your life, if we need to pray for you, if you'd like to study, if you just like to talk, please let us know as we stand and as we sing together.
Into the fold.